Hi, my name is Alyse Bensel, and I am part of the panel Against Shame Towards Embodiment, Expression and Pleasure in the 21st Century Creative Writing Classroom, part of the virtual Creative Writing Studies Conference. And the title of my presentation is Embodiment in the Creative Writing Classroom. When I enter the classroom, space shifts. A colleague has arranged the desks into an incomplete rectangle or evenly spaced rows, a remnant of the past year's social distancing guidelines. My students, occupying this space, sit silently with their phones or talk with a neighbor. They ask me questions, then mumble or enthusiastically reply, or do not reply at all to my own questions. They are a sea of eyes peering from face masks, some with inventive patterns, others ill-fitting. They ignore their masks or fidget with them throughout class. The masks expose their physical discomfort in ways that academic spaces often obfuscate or ignore bodies. At the 2017 Creative Writing Studies Conference, poet Meg Day opened their talk for the panel, Accommodating Ableism, How Creative Writing Privileges Normates and What We Are Doing About It, by acknowledging and observing the physical space we were occupying, its dimensions, limitations, acoustics, how it was or was not conducive to a conference panel, and the ensuing discussion. I followed Day's observations. So often I had been asked to ignore or deny the physical space around me, no matter my reactions, instead focusing on the intellectual work in this false bifurcation. Yet psychologists have discussed how learning and other high-level executive functioning skills require specific conditions. If you are focused on survival, learning is left behind, like how a student entered my classroom and insisted on sitting in the back, near the door, with no one behind him, so that he could feel safe. When I remind students that I value their bodily existence, I observe how some shift in their seats and how some others show indications that they are engaging with me. I remind them that if they need to leave the classroom or move around the space for any reason, they may do so. The fact that I must give them permission, that I may have never had such acknowledgement given before, is a constant reminder of how the classroom is often one of control, a power dynamic I can never fully equalize, but that I can acknowledge. As Bell Hooks argues in Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, it is equally crucial that we learn to enter the classroom whole and not as disembodied spirit. The creative writing classroom is not immune to these power dynamics, many of which are perpetuated through the Iowa Writers' Workshop model. This includes gag orders, a silencing that Felicia Rose Chavez in the Anti-Racist Workshop, How to Decolonize the Creative Writing Classroom points out, is so profound it enlists writers of color to eradicate ourselves, favoring a false notion of pure intellect rather than embodiment, and obsessing over craft and its many conventions. Such practices can deny the physical bodies in the classroom in one form or another by setting parameters for control that reinforce monolithic knowledge and colonize and police students and educators themselves, remaking those oppressive forces in another image. Chavez's anti-racist model fully acknowledges bodily presence in the creative writing classroom by discussing the erasure of people of color and LGBTQ+ folks within the academy. A way forward, Chavez argues, is through practices often deemed as anti-intellectual in such spaces. The Anti-Racist Workshop is a study in love, Chavez writes. It advances humility and empathy over control and domination. A domination, as Matthew Salesses points out in Craft in the Real World, that is steeped in the legacy of the Western Empire and Aristotelian aesthetics. When the body is divorced from intellectual spaces and practices, pedagogical avenues that empower the classroom and allow both educators and students to proclaim bodily autonomy can be deemed unsuitable for academic study. What place does the body have? Its physical experiences of pleasure, joy, pain, grief, those unseemly emotional states, in creative practice. But there is a well-documented tradition of embodied poetic practices. In The Right to Manifest Manifesto, From a Beautiful Marsupial Afternoon, poet C.A. Conrad proclaims, I cannot stress enough how much this mechanistic world, as it becomes more and more efficient, resulting in ever-increasing brutality, has required me to find my body, to find my planet, in order to find my poetry. Conrad explains somatic poetry as acting twofold, by advocating for creative viability for all and using creativity as a catalyst for sustainability. The physicality of these somatic experiences and the accompanying result of Conrad's experience in the poem are essential in bringing the body back into process in the poem itself, providing open-ended, embodied models for students. There is more than one practice that can refocus attention on embodiment in creative writing classrooms. In her foreword to the groundbreaking anthology Embodied, an intersectional feminist comics poetry anthology, editor Wendy Chin Tanner describes the project as, quote, the first comics poetry anthology that marries the unique aspects of poetry with those of sequential art in a collection of stories focused on gender, identity, and the body. The artists often gravitate toward the body in their graphic representations, like in Jen Given's poem Rubble Girl, where the naked girl dances among the elements and is rendered physically unraveled in the lines, "Girl, hungry girl, you unstitched razor girl," in both visceral and metaphorical depictions. By framing creative writing pedagogy through the lens of the body, we can begin to resist the dichotomies between pleasure and labor, of experience only into sellable product, and instead redirect toward process, practice, and embodiment. We are each a body in flux. Creative writing practices can engage with rather than control or suppress that flux, working through the body rather than against it, in acts of transformation that move toward our expressive power.